So what we're talking about is Rākau momori, which are tree markings in the Chatham Islands. Rākau is about 800 kilometres west of the South Island of New Zealand, and it was first settled around 1500 AD or before 1500 AD, with the indigenous people being Moriori. They're genetically, linguistically, in terms of material culture and art, very closely related to New Zealand Māori. And then traditional name for the two main islands over there are Rākau and Rangihaupē. In the 1830s, two tribes from the west coast of the North Island, Ngati Mutunga and Ngati Tama, migrated over there to the Chatham Islands and devastated the indigenous Moriori people. And so the other name, the Māori name for over in the Chatham Islands is Wharekauri. In English, we typically refer to the Chatham Island as being the larger of the main islands, Pitt Island is the smaller, and colloquially we just know them as the Chathams. In recent years, the Moriori's struggles to have their voices recognised as the indigenous people of the Chathams has gained some strength and gained some recognition, and they're today represented through the Hokotehi Moriori Trust. Now, the trees we're talking about are Kopi trees, as they're known over there on the Chathams. In New Zealand, they're known as karaka. That's the Māori term for them. They're a moderate-sized tree. They're very hard to date because they don't have annual growth rings like many other trees, but they can grow to quite a moderate size and live several hundred years old. They're naturally distributed in the northern part of the North Island, but they're found right throughout New Zealand and also on the Chathams, where they've been deliberately planted by Moriori on the Chathams and by Māori in both the North and South Islands, because they've got a berry in them, and that orange berry has a little kernel, a nut, which is highly toxic, but if treated right, is a wonderful carbohydrate resource. So they're purposefully planted around Māori and Moriori settlements as a food resource. The Kopi is now naturalised over in the Chatham Islands, but was certainly from deliberate Polynesian plantings. The Moriori traditional knowledge refers to it as having been brought on one of their ancestral waka, one of their ancestral canoes called the Rangimata. Now, one of the things with the Kopi and the Chathams on Rākau is they've got these incredible tree markings on them, these wonderful motifs of ancestral representations. Archaeologically, they're referred to as dendroglyphs, but the modern name for them is, it's a new name, but a modern name is Rākau momori, which is a more respectful term that refers to them as trees that carry ancestral memory. In the 1950s, there were more than 200 odd Kopi trees that still had these markings on them. And at about 2000 though, there were only about 147 that were recorded. They're dispersed across Rākau, especially the more northern part, and they're also found on Rangihaupē Pitt Island. But the distribution of them is significantly reduced, which is in a large part due to the conversion to grazing land on the Chathams, the historical conversion to grazing land. One of the surviving glades is Hapupu, which is a historic preserve that's been created specifically for the preservation of these Rākau momori in the field. And in 2010, one of our co-writers of this paper, Richard Hemi, and his colleagues went over to Rākau, the Chathams, and they trialled the scanning of the Rākau with a Creaform Handyscan 3D laser scanner, and they actually recorded about 70 different Kopi trees. With the outputs of that recording was really interesting in that it through the depth, it revealed some of the motifs that you can't discern by eye. So it did actually allow sort of the recognition of more facile, more of these motifs than is recognised, but that data did not have colour. It wasn't, the machine didn't record coloured data. One of the things with the Kopi is some of the trees are nearing their end of life, and on account of that, they have been, some have recently, or more recent years, been removed to Te Kopinga Marae, which is the Marae being the cultural centre of Moriori today over on the Chathams. Historically, more trunks had been removed, with more trunks with markings, and they'd been taken to the mainland museums. The idea, the notion was that they were being preserved, and certainly they were on one level, but it also reflected the anthropological collecting of the early 1900s and later. So it reflected the anthropological collecting of the museums, I should say. And so that brings us to some of the ones in Otago Museum. Importantly here, rather than just collecting the bark, Otago Museum collected the whole trunk, or a section of the trunk with these ancestral images on them. Part of a cultural rebuilding project by Moriori has seen them reconnecting with their treasures. It's been a part of their whole cultural revival, and they have found, and so when they came to Otago Museum to reconnect with their treasures here and saw how they're stored in the crates, how they were strapped up, and that suffice to say it was emotionally and culturally challenging. So this led Moriori to work with Otago Museum to initiate a conservation assessment, partly with the idea of understanding the current condition of the Rākau, but also to evaluate their stability and potential risks if they were at some point transferred potentially back to the islands. So we got Hokatihi Trust got a lotteries grant, which was of great support, but it's still to do a conservation assessment, but it still left us the challenge of how do we get and access all these 20 trunks in that way. So what we fortunately had at the time was an empty gallery. So we got all of the Rākau out, all 20 of them. We set them up, we spread them out so that the conservation assessment could proceed. But at that time, we also decided it would be a really good idea to try to do some 3D digital recording. And so this was undertaken by the survey school at Otago University, led by Richard Hemi, and using a Creaform GoScan Spark, which is a handheld structured light scanner, and using Creaform VX Elements software. So it was a bit similar to the moving around physically around the Rākau, the trees, was similar to that in the field. And it proved to be a straightforward and achievable way of recording them like that in the museum setting. But we also decided to do photogrammetry, which required a bit more space than the laser scanning, but it was still achievable. And importantly, we were able to use a standard DSLR, and it was able to be undertaken by our own museum collections management staff. So that also proved to be straightforward as long as we could get the Rākau, get the trunks out into open space. And depending on their size, we typically took about between 90 and 300 shots or photographs of each Rākau, which we then Dropboxed to Josh Emmitt up at Auckland University, who remotely produced the models. And at this point, I'll hand over to Josh if you'd like to cut in, Josh, and korero to the models here.
Kia ora, Gerard. Kia ora, everyone. Yeah, so my name is Josh Emmitt. I'm from the University of Auckland. I was originally meant to go out and photograph all of these wonderful objects, and then we went into another lockdown. So as that seems to be the trend. So that didn't happen, but luckily Gerard was able to get the photos taken for me, which if anyone's done photogrammetry probably knows that I got off a bit easy on that one. So what we did was compare with the photogrammetry and the laser scanning. We've obviously got two complementary methods, and one of the traditional things about merging these two types was to introduce color from the photogrammetry onto the laser scans. However, with new laser scanners, you can get color. So this is a changing paradigm in the way these data are collected. But one thing we did was, or we're starting to do, is to compare the two results. So what is the accuracy between the photogrammetry models and the laser scanner? And I was doing this analysis, and I was really hoping to have this result that I could show you and discuss, and we could compare and contrast. So on the left, what you can see is a photogrammetry model. In the middle there, you can see a laser scan model. And on the right is there a comparison, and blue means that they're basically the same. So I haven't got much to talk to you about on this. They're all within about 0.5 millimeter in accuracy. Where we do get differentials is where it would be expected, along the flat area, along the top that you can't see. But that was mainly because it was filled in, because that wasn't necessarily captured. And also around the bottom where the bark is split. So this is where we see the most difference, but largely the two methods are effectively the same in what they're capturing in terms of the difference between them. And they can both be processed down to about 1 millimeter in accuracy, a bit more with a laser scanner at a higher resolution. So in that respect, there's no difference. And I was like, oh no, what am I going to talk to you about? But one of the key differences here is color. So you might see that perhaps the photogrammetry model looks a little bit more washed out than the laser scanner. There's a couple of reasons for this. It's because you're capturing obviously with the light that's available in the room at the time, and you can put up extra lights to try and balance it. But effectively with the photogrammetry models, it's been through a bit more image processing to remove the ambient light so that you can put it into software like Sketchfab, which I'll show on the next slide, where you can add artificial lights and start highlighting more of the features on the bark and on the object. The other thing is perhaps that photogrammetry is a bit more accessible in terms of you don't need a specialized machine. However, they are a little bit different, but we probably wouldn't need to do both in the future. Moving forward, one or the other would largely suffice for for capturing these objects. So that's mainly the difference between the models, but I was pleasantly surprised when I saw the comparison that there isn't really a difference. Gerard, would you mind switching to the next slide, please? Thank you. Switch online for the notes. So while what Gerard mentioned is that while a lot of the Moriori are still on the Chathams, they also live today in many centres across New Zealand, so it's a dispersed community. We see similar challenges elsewhere, especially with traditional owners in Australia, and thinking about some of the objects that are spread around the world. And so 3D provides a way to share these objects with people. It's obviously not a complete substitute for having the physical object, but it is arguably a step in the right direction to getting people access to their heritage. So the online models we've hosted through Sketchfab at this point. We have an account with the University of Auckland, so we've just used that. And obviously we've had to reduce the resolution to about 500,000 faces just to make the sizes of the models reasonable for most internet connections. However, as I've been discussing with the island, that this might be too large in itself. So what we're going to do is build a little 3D repository server on a memory stick and ship it out to them so that they've got a copy for out there they can run on any laptop really. At the moment, all these are password protected, mainly because, and they'll be shared as it's deemed appropriate to do so by the trust. But yeah, lots of applications for this. Initially, I just did it because I thought it'd be great to get the data out there, and so the community could be could interact with their heritage, and that's definitely the main output of this. But what's going to also happen is they're going to be included in a new island on the new museum on the Chathams, which will be really cool. But also more recently is Te Papa, the National Museum in Wellington, is updating their Moriori exhibition, and they'll be as a permanent display, and they'll be incorporating these 3D models as part of that. So that's something that's happened in the past week, but it's quite exciting. And the other thing about it, what we're looking at is a future project using these models to incorporate them back into their landscape. So using the historical archives at Otago Museum, building on some of the work of that earlier project from 2010, looking through all the information that we can glean and try and ascertain where these where they came from on the island, and perhaps even if we can find some of the stumps, try and put them back, reorient them on the landscape, and try and create more of a complete picture of the landscape. But we won't be able to put them back physically, and obviously anything digital will be in kind of an AR format, but at the same time, it would allow these objects to be placed at least digitally back into their context, which I believe would be quite important, not only for those for the Moriori, but also just in terms of trying to ascertain what these might have meant in the past and how they relate to one another, because obviously they don't exist in isolation, even though they might now. So at this point, I will hand back to Gerard. Thank you for listening to me. You're muted.
Thank you, Josh. Yeah, just to finish up, coming back to where we sort of started off with this idea of the project being initially a conservation assessment. Some of the immediate objectives that we've been able to realise is that we can communicate through these models. We can communicate directly between the museum and the Chatham Islands in terms of looking at the Rākau, their fragilities and their sensitivities, and the people over on the Chathams can actually get a direct understanding of what we're talking about, and by referencing and manipulating the models. One of the things that we're really excited about is it's going to inform better construction of both exhibition furniture, but also potential packing crates and so forth, and storage facilities for the Rākau. When you look at the models, you can see that they have that the trunks of the trees have shrunk over time, and they've shrunk away from the bark. And so one of the things we can do with the 3D models, that we're looking to do, is actually get them printed out, get smaller scale versions of them printed out, and actually experiment with different mounting and different storage facilities. There is a scope to potentially include the digital models, annotate the models, and use them for sort of easy 3D condition reporting, and make it so that we can go in there and easily compare the differences between the cracks over time, some of the cracks in the trunks. But importantly, for when we look at that, it won't ever get away from the fact that we actually need to look at from a conservation end, we need to look at these in detail physically, because one of the things is with the bark coming away from the trunks, while we can see parts of it in places, we can't see it all the whole way around the bark. And so the fragility of the trees, the fragility of the bark on the wood, it still needs that kind of, if you like, that sort of sense of feel and touch to be able to understand how rigid or how flexible different parts of the treasure are. But most importantly, the most important thing is that what we're now in a position to do is explore both on the conservation side of things and on the exhibition engagement side of things, new ways, new approaches, and it's reshaping the relationship with that Moriori are able to have with their own treasures, but it's also reshaping the relationship and understanding of our respective responsibilities between the museum and the source community of these treasures. And that's the most important thing, is we can better uphold the respect of the ancestors that these memorial trees represent. And so on that, we'll conclude tēnā te mihi kia koutou, tēnā rā koutou katoa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerard and Josh. Fantastic project, really fascinating. I got a few questions here in the chat window from Alice is interested in the community response, if they had any preferences in terms of the different scanning techniques you use.
No, as far as we're no, there hasn't been a difference in the scanning techniques or the photogrammetry. You know, the difference. They're interested in the outputs of both, and that's been the key thing for us. Is as Josh was saying, because the outputs are comparable, we feel that we can actually go ahead with either of those in the future, as opposed to sort of perhaps thinking we'll go ahead with doing more photogrammetry, but we're somehow producing a substandard result compared to if we got them lasers, if we got them scanned differently. So that's been the exciting thing about it from our end. Importantly, from our end, in terms of the time to record, both of them took the same amount of time, the same amount of effort.
So it talked about the millimeter accuracy. Is that enough for a scan, or do you hope in future there will be a higher accuracy technique available?
I might take that one, Gerard, but I think the thing with the millimeter scan, I mean, is we can generate these things to the resolution. I mean, the laser scanners can generate to a set resolution, whereas the photogrammetry is a little bit dependent on the input photos and the processes and how the algorithm interprets it. So having said that, the algorithms are changing. So we process that again in 5 years, and it could be at a much higher resolution. But I think the thing comes down to is what the questions are. So for a community engagement, and we're decimating the quality in terms of just for making it accessible, then we probably don't need millimeter precision on these objects. Whereas when we're looking at, say, making stands, we probably need a bit more, but we don't necessarily need, again, millimeter. However, I believe we should obtain the best data we can now, because we've now got data from 2010, we've got data from now, do it again in 10 years, and we can start to get a model of, say, the bark shrinkage or how conservation efforts are being affected. So I think for the questions of this particular project, the resolution's appropriate, but moving forward, I think more is always better.
Thank you very much.